Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming to Silver Lining for Learning, which Chris was joking about. We might run another show called The Sky is Falling, but we're at 32 episode, and this is a time for us to reflect and to rethink about where we are, what we have learned, and to share with you what we think,
Thank you very much.
can go and should go. So let me actually still start like we did before. We just have each person to some kind of reflection about what they've learned from both our guests as well as our own observations. Let me actually start with Scott, who is near a big fire and in case he has to run away. And so let's start with Scott.
Thank you, Young. I don't know if I'm quite in that much of an imminent danger that I have to run away during the episode. But for those of you who don't know, we've got some pretty bad wildfire action out here in Colorado. So my head is in a little different place, and I don't know if this is where we want to start, but you called on me first, so now you get it, whether you want it or not. I'm thinking about what we have on our homepage. And our homepage says the following. This disruption provides us with an opportunity to reimagine learning and teaching in order to create an equitable and humanistic learning ecosystem for all. Barriers and structures that have resisted much needed change are now in disarray, offering the chance for transformative improvements. We seek to begin this reimagining through a series of conversations of emerging trends, disruptive policies, programs, initiatives, and often controversial, murky, and unspoken topics. And I think, what I'm wondering today is, have we lived up to that ideal? Have we lived up to our own rhetoric? What do we think?
You're raising a genuine question, or was rhetorical?
No, that's a genuine question.
All right, then you run the show, you ask.
So if I can respond to that briefly, and I'm glad that Scott, you brought that up, because I think it's important that we recycle back to what was, when we wrote it, seemed relevant, and I think it still does. I think one or a couple of things I think that have sort of appeared over the sessions is China is one example where it has gone back to sort of what it was before, right? And so yes, this thing came and it happened, and it's not really gone, but at the level of a nation, it has responded a certain way, and it's gone back to what people thought was quote unquote the normal, right? So there is no new normal. It is the old normal that's gone back. I think so. So from that point of view, the expectation that this would fundamentally shift things, at least in that example, has not panned out, right? However, I do think that we are still, the consequences of this are going to be felt 2, 3, 4 years down the road, because the economic toll, we haven't paid that bill yet. We don't even know what that bill is. And I think whether it's K-12 or higher ed, we'll be forced to make shift just because of the economic toll that's, and the kind of policies that will emerge from whatever the next administration, at least speaking in the United States, it's going to be. The other thing, coming back to the other point, I think, have we met sort of that initial standard? I think that we have relatively shied away from controversy. So I don't think we have gotten guests here who have completely questioned us or, fundamentally questioned certain things. I think we've gotten people who, and given the title Silver Lining, I think our leaning has been towards, people who are seeing a silver lining. That said, I mean, we have also gone through, apart from the, with the George Floyd and the, Black Lives Matter movement and the sort of increased attention to issues of race and equity, we really haven't gotten anybody guests here who have sort of unasked some things or questioned some fundamentals, which we don't even realize can be questioned maybe. I don't even know till we have those conversations. So I would give us if I had to give a grade, like a B or a B plus, for effort, for putting in the time, bringing some interesting guests together, but not so much as meeting some of those sort of asking some of those more critical questions. Maybe, again, this is just one person's view, right? So I will stop and hear what others have to say in that. But thank you for raising that. That's a great start.
Chris, you want to jump in?
Well, first, I would agree with what Punya has said. And what I've been thinking about is that we now have a different mental model of the future than we did when we wrote those words and when we started the initiative. That we thought of the pandemic at that time as having a fixed length. Maybe it was 3 months, maybe it was 6 months, maybe it was a year. But then it was going to be over. And then the fear was that things would regress to where they were before. My mental model now is that it's never going to be over, in the sense that we would be able to go back to where we were before, even if we wanted to. Now, I understand about China, but if the rest of the world stays highly infected, China is not going to be able to continue to keep it out. It's just too big a country with too many borders, and the rest of the world is going crazy with the virus. So I'm envisioning a future in which there's some kind of miracle, in which we have a disease that has some kind of partially effective vaccine, but it continues to be deadly. It doesn't convey lifetime immunity, and we have to learn to live with it in the way that for a long time the world lived with tuberculosis, for example. So I'm less worried now about things going back, and more worried about how we keep the quality of education when it looks like, in my mental model, there's going to be some people face-to-face and some people across distance in the same classroom, for a variety of reasons: economic, health, social, whatever. And that is a tough kind of teaching. I think it's potentially a powerful kind of teaching, because it has elements of both and, but it's a really tough kind of teaching. And I'm trying to think about that, not only in general terms, but I'm trying to think about that in personal terms, because I think Harvard next September, unless I'm wrong about where the pandemic is going to have that situation where I'll be in a face-to-face classroom at least some of the time with some face-to-face students. Other students will be totally remote, but we're not going to teach the same thing twice, once face-to-face and once remote. So what are we going to do? And I think there are some interesting technological approaches to that. But I think that for me, the center of gravity for the program is shifting from how do we have a brave new world of face-to-face learning that replaces the bad old world of face-to-face learning, and that brave new world recognizes the power of online, into how do we cope with this weird combination of face-to-face and forced remote, and try to get the benefits of each rather than the disadvantages of each. So that's where I am right now in my take on what's on the homepage.
I was wondering, Kurt, looks like you were writing something, and what do you think of Scott's very challenging but very important question?
Scott's right as always, and he's gotten us all to think, which is important, because I wasn't thinking before I arrived.
It's hard. I
I think you got four things here that Punya and Chris and Scott have brought up, and they could be four themes, just like Global South was a theme in some ways. And first of all, the challenges. You know, that is in our mission statement, and I agree with Scott that we haven't posed a lot of challenges to our listeners, viewers, to ourselves. And that might be a series of shows, the challenges including assessment being a challenge, and what will assessment look like in the future. Training of teachers is a challenge in this time. You know, what is that looking like now? What might that look like in the future? And training of superintendents, you know, to run schools that are different. You know, a lot of challenges there. So I think you're right, Scott. And I think challenges might actually bring us more attention from people who will say, can you believe what happened in Silver Lining for Learning last week? You know, and they send the note to someone else and that forwards it to someone else. So I think a little bit more dissonance could be valuable to us. So that's one. I think that Chris is right in the combo kind of learning. My former student, Brian Beatty, created the high flex model, which is somewhat controversial, ties in with controversy and challenge. And we could easily bring in Brian and other people. I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, several folks who were doing different blends of learning that were being highlighted in Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Ed at various institutions. And so I think that's something that would be of value to people watching. It would be of value to people watching the reruns of, if we had a couple in a series, a theme related to hybrid learning or blended learning or whatever we wanted to call it at the time. In 2006, I had a handbook of blended learning, and Charles Graham was a co-editor with me, and he'd be really valuable in that regard. There are many other people that we could bring in to talk about the blends that are occurring at the K-12 or at the higher ed or at the corporate level. Or other forms of learning. So that's the second thing. I think third, Punya's right, innovation. We've been getting at innovation somewhat, but really we could push that a little bit more. And I think each of us could maybe, you know, push ourselves to think about where, and the fourth thing is transformation. Scott's saying, maybe are we really getting at transformations in our mission statement? Well, where is one transformation that we've come across occurring? And we could nominate different folks who are, you know, doing transformative types of teaching and learning and assessment. So those four themes, challenges, innovations, transformations, and combinations are possible themes or approaches or things that we might look at. We do have shows to fill in the next couple of months. We have a lot of open gaps. Here are some opportunities. I'm sure Young has several more that he's smiling, so he must have a few more to add to the list. So go ahead, Young.
Well, no, I was going to get Scott's answer before I answer the question, because I actually really appreciate that question. I just wonder, Scott, you know, what's your take?
So I said this in our chat, our internal chat to ourselves. I'm trying to figure out if for most of, I think we've had some really interesting conversations, and I think that we have highlighted some fascinating work that's happening all around the world. And I really appreciate that we've been able to draw from our various connections around the globe to do that. Every week we talk about things that I think are interesting. I don't know if most weeks we talk about things that are transformational, that are really reimagining learning. Some of that's hard to say, because what might be transformational, say in the Global South context, might not be transformational in an American context, for example, right? Because the focus and the needs are different, or vice versa. So some of that is, you know, transformation is in the eye of the beholder. I'm trying to figure out, however, if we're about more than just talking about interesting things that are happening with technology and learning. Like, are we more than that, or are we just telling interesting stories? That's kind of what's in my head right now.
You know, I just want to respond to this. I think actually we've done pretty good job. First of all, let me say, China is an exception, but it's, as I agree with Chris, it's going to come back. Just yesterday, they saw another case, and but China has a very different way of honestly approaching these issues at any cost. See if they find one person, they shut down the whole place. It's just it's shocking how they react to that, and and I don't think it can be done in other places, but they are always on the alert. They can't just be comfortable saying, "Oh yeah, we're good." So it's a very interesting case, and we don't know where it's going to happen. So that was more about update about China, but I think we've learned a few things. I think I'm seeing happening right now. First of all, I do believe, globally speaking, there's a lot more access to the hardware issues. Technology is getting to places. I know there's a lot of people who don't have it, but definitely because of COVID, we are deploying a lot more hardware to a lot more people than before. A lot more doesn't mean we have everything, but a lot more. Second thing, from my interactions, I've seen a lot more teachers are getting globally connected. They are not teaching in a traditional way. So and now many of them, because they're online, because they're doing remote, they have accessed a lot more global resources. That's something I think we should be pretty happy about. The third part is that I'm seeing is that a lot more individual students. Again, when I said a lot more, it doesn't mean overwhelming. It just means a lot more. Students individually have embarked on their own learning journey. You say a lot more students just because they're tired of learning locally or whatever they're doing. The fact is that, and then another reason is that I also think a lot more children are given more access to technology, which they would not have been given, before this COVID. Parents were just not allowing them to get online, and now there are a lot more getting online. I think that's something. And last week, Chris, the guests we had from Brookings, I think they were very, very good. They brought in some really interesting thoughts about, even in the global South, in developing countries, a lot more organizations and parents are more involved in education. So I think those are the good things. Those good things may not transform education for everybody, but do transform education for the individuals who are involved in that. I think that's something. And so the other issues I think we have not been dealing with on our show, but I think we should have, but we will never do it because it's political. You look at COVID-19 is interacting very seriously with the geopolitics. I think Punya, I'm highlighting you because you were from India. I think there's a lot more global attention now on India moving away from China. That this is a lot more interaction, India, Indonesia, and a lot of, but the geopolitics, the almost collapsing or reconfiguration of globalization is going to have significant impact on education, on global migration, global students, global collaboration. That's something. Another thing Punya said is that it's the economics. We have not figured out the bill, and that's going to affect a lot of education in different ways. We really don't know how actually the global higher education is going to play out in different places, in different kind of locations. But then there's another element which I have been very interested in understanding is this conversation about this COVID loss of learning, the loss of learning. There are people arguing about, our children are behind, certain things, our children are not learning. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are not learning, but again, as our guest said last week, some kids are learning better. They don't want to go back to school. How is that going to happen? So I think, one of the issues I'm personally very interested in is this loss. How do you understand the loss? So with that. But I know Punya, you have some comments. Go ahead.
Thanks, Zhao. So the last one is one, just to build on that one, I've been thinking quite a bit about. And I think that it depends on how we are defining what, and it comes back to the issue of assessment and what learning means. Because in some ways, one can argue that by being more involved within the like the parents and so on being, I mean, that is assuming that you have the sort of resources that you can. I mean, so given that, there might actually be more learning happening in ways that are not classically what we talk about when we talk about school learning, right? And so any discussion of loss needs to take that into account. But I wanted to come back to this sort of economics issue. And one of the things that anybody who studies, let's say, even disasters of the sort of like a hurricane or something that way. I was listening to this podcast the other day about hurricanes in sort of Florida and what kind of changes that happened over time. Basically, what happens in each of these situations is there are certain underlying trends and movements that are happening. And what happens is that because of that crisis, the shift that happens, it just speeds up those underlying trends and movements. So in our case, an example would be this sort of adaptation of online or technology entering into, you know, places where it didn't necessarily seem like a priority. Now it's become a priority. And so I think it'll be wonderful to get somebody who is sort of seeing sort of the history of education or the economics education in sort of a more longer term. And I've reminded Chris of, I think it was Andrew Scott, who I met when he had invited us for the 60-year curriculum book. And one quote he said sort of stayed with me. And one thing he said is that the 20th century invented the idea of teenagers and retirement. And he asked the question of what will the 21st century invent? And at first I was like, that's silly. I mean, people have been turning 13 since forever. So what does that even mean? And so I actually went and started doing some sort of, you know, doing my own little sort of Google research and, you know, looking things up a little bit. And turns out that we didn't have a term for teenagers till high schools, kids having a little more autonomy and freedom, kids having a little more money, like either from their parents or being able to work. That created that group. And so that's a completely sort of mid 20th century invention. Retirement, turns out that it was not until 1897 that in Germany, when there was the because the workers' unions and all of those things were being formed, that King Wilhelm or whoever was there said, oh, we need to give money to people who, you know, otherwise life used to be you are born, you work. I mean, even childhood, the idea of childhood that we have today is very different from the idea of childhood in many societies and cultures in the past. And so in some ways, these things which we take for granted are really powerful social constructions. And it is at these moments of slippage that I think some of these things can get not questioned in some, I think the way we sort of set up the question in Silver Lining, which is, oh, this is a deliberate chance to go ahead and make some change, but that what are some underlying trends that are happening, which because of the disruption will actually get pushed to the foreground and will play out over the next 8, 10, 15 years until we end up with a slightly different world or a different way of conceptualizing what learning is, what childhood means, what teenagers mean, what lifelong learning means, all of those things. So I think it'll be fascinating to get somebody who takes sort of a sort of what we would call a long view of these trends. And I would love that because it would help me frame. And I think, you know, Chris, you always give us some really nice quotes from history, which I think set the frame for the conversation in a wider way. And I wonder if getting some guests like that would just allow us to, you know, frame these discussions or these trends, not in necessarily narrow ways, but in sort of more long-term trends. So that's just sort of a thought that I've been having. Wanted to share that.
Well, thanks, Punya. I think I would love to have a philosopher or historian come of childhood of education talk about this, because, you know, the modern education system is not that old, you know, that what we've been trying to do. And we should not really imagine we used to have Socrates for everybody or Confucius for everybody. That was very rare, actually. It did not really happen a lot. So that's something I think is worth thinking about. You know, concerning the idea about learning loss, it is actually, there's another set too, you know, who lost and what's get lost. If you didn't gain it, how did you lose it? So that's another simple thing. Okay, Kurt, you were going to say something?
Well, that's in my new article in Distance Ed, you know, just this pivot. Who pivoted, you know, and why is online deemed to be inferior to face always, like it's automatically going to be inferior. It might, aspects might be, but there's an assumption that we're moving to an inferior delivery mechanism instead of looking at the opportunities that you can take advantage of. And I think you were right. I think Chris is right. I think Punya is right, and Scott was right. I mean, you all have made excellent points about new opportunities that teachers are provided to be more global in nature and to rethink their learning patterns and structures and so forth. So it's been an area that I've been knee deep in for a long time, looking at the cross-cultural aspects of learning. And now everyone's attuned to it, I think, a little bit better. And will continue to be. We've ramped up, and basically we've ramped up the thinking on this. So we've gone into 2030 mode in 2020. You know, we've started thinking ahead, and I think you're right. Getting a philosopher of education, getting someone who thinks long term, like, you know, Chris here's the role model, but there are other people like Chris who have a different spin on it or a different view. Chris may know of some folks that he would recommend, some futurists out there. Chris, do you have any suggestions of someone we might bring in like that?
Well, I think it's hard to have a generic macro historian like Toynbee or Sorokin were. And I'm not sure how much light they would cast on the specific issue of education. But I've been thinking a lot about tuberculosis because in the mid 1850s, in the most developed countries at that time, tuberculosis was killing about 1.25% of the population every year, which is about what this pandemic is doing in the most developed countries. And how did they handle it? I think a historian on that would be interesting. I also was struck in looking at this that there's 1.4 million people worldwide dying every year from tuberculosis, which is a curable disease. That's a big number. I mean, that's maybe not as high as the pandemic will be, but it's interesting to ask, you know, how do countries with pandemics in general, setting aside COVID, how historically have we handled pandemics in education? I think that historical. But I want to go back to the transformative, because I agree that we haven't been as transformative as we could be. And I think that it was appropriate to be tactical when we were just trying to give people hope. But now that we've shown a way of doing that, maybe it's time to show a way of thinking about deep transformative issues. And there are two that I'm thinking about right now. One of them is if artificial intelligence and machine learning are taking over more and more of what used to be considered human skills, how do we educate for the human skills that AI can't take over? And what does an education system look like where there's a partnership with a different kind of intelligence? And so you just don't bother to do much education of those skills and that knowledge beyond the fact that you want people to know it's not magic. So because of calculators, we no longer value instant, accurate calculation of pages and pages and pages of numbers, because there are machines that do that, but we do want people to understand what the number line is. So I think that's a really interesting question. I'm trying to think about the human side of it. And I think you could have a series of speakers who would each present a different perspective on what the human side is, and then try to get them to think about what that means for the educational system, which people by and large are not thinking about right now. The other one is dispositions. We're moving into a very, very turbulent and difficult half century. pandemic is the tip of the iceberg. And we've seen that some people are energized by uncertainty and ambiguity and risk, and they become heroic. And other people, perhaps the majority, are paralyzed by it. And on any given day, you can have a little of each too within the same person. So how do we educate people in times like this with dispositions that are resilient, flexible, innovative, welcoming, thriving on chaos, as Tom Peters used to say? And to what extent are adult dispositions malleable? I think that's a really interesting transformative question. I'm not pushing those two necessarily, but that would be another direction that we could go. I'm not sure there are a lot of really transformative things happening in education, but we could pick a theme where transformative things need to happen. And maybe it's an equity theme rather than one of the themes I've identified. And then we could bring in people who deeply understand the issues, and then we try to get them to think about what it means for educational redesign.
Chris, I don't know about our audience, but I know the audience who are always with us. The big concerns they have seen, almost every time when we do something, they talk about number one, equity, big issues, equity issue. And, when we are doing a show and if we pretend to do a show that's global, equity on a global scale is huge. That's one. So I honestly, I'm very careful about equity, but I really don't know how to address that. I don't think a show like this, we can truly be there because there are so many people addressing equity issues. It's something like you have to live on every day, which is that is one issue. Another issue I think our audience is quite interested in, and this has shown a bias towards, is student-driven learning. That is, how do we cultivate student autonomy, student personalization? I think what you brought about is the idea about AI. I was just reading a report that came out of the World Economic Forum, then was rebroadcast by BBC, talking about in 5 years, because COVID has helped. If half of our jobs will be done by AI-driven or other technologies, what would that mean? 5 years, 2025. They're also projecting that about 44% of jobs will be done remotely. The companies will move their jobs to be remotely. So those things, also, of course, they've talked about already, if you look at the white collar jobs in the US, in many developed countries, are done remote now, will keep that way in many companies. I don't think schools have done honest transformation in teaching what really matters. I don't think so. By and large, most schools, are still teaching what used to be. So I think it'll be, I would be interested in, like, say, Punya, Scott, and Kurt, what's your response to that?
So I think this connects with sort of the broader economic theme idea that I was talking about, which is a huge part of what schools do is prepare people for the future. And when we look at these trends, and I think this is where I think this point comes up again, which is that at times of crisis, some things which were sort of subterranean and sort of happening in a very gradual way suddenly come up to the forefront. And so I think this idea of remote work, this idea of AI, they were already happening, right? Those trends were already there. And I think what this will do is bring it, and you're absolutely right. I don't think that as educational systems, we have confronted what these are going to mean. The other one is sort of, the rise of the gig economy, which you're going to see more and more of, where, it's not just going to be for driving and delivering food. It's going to start moving up the chain to other tasks, where it'll be basically skill-based guns for hire kind of a process. And how we prepare people for situations like that is going to be very interesting to see. I think the other trend that's huge, which I think will have impact on is going to be sort of the e-economy. As more and more of our finances move online, and how do we prepare people for those kinds of worlds? And I mean, it's just I think there's a lot of interesting disruptions happening, and I think it'll be cool to have somebody come and talk about what those trends are, and then for us to discuss what education needs to be doing to transform to meet those trends. And so AI is a great example of that.
Scott?
I think you're right, Young, that most schools have not really rethought what kind of desired learner outcomes and competencies they're striving for, right? So they hadn't done that work before COVID. They surely aren't doing it during COVID. I think where I find my hope is in the ones that had started that work beforehand, right? So I think about a lot of these project and inquiry-based schools that place a great emphasis on deeper learning rather than wide and shallow learning. They focus a lot on sort of real-world authentic work, giving kids lots of agency and ownership and self-direction of that learning. And then the technology, of course, is just a tool to help with that rich, robust learning in a different way. And I'm pretty sure that those students' learning experiences are very different during COVID than more traditional school students who are still trying to be force-fed, low-level factual recall and procedural regurgitation. But their learning was different before then, right? It was different before the pandemic as well. And I think it would be interesting for us to have a series where we heard from some different schools and educators about how do we take that deeper learning that so many of the hosts are in favor of and transfer that into pandemic context. How do we still make those things happen? So the transformation actually wasn't happening because of COVID. The transformation of learning and teaching was actually happening before the pandemic. And the question is how they carried that into sort of these weird pandemic modalities and still been successful. I think that's an interesting conversation.
Well, if you look at the episodes we had students, apparently many of the students, we pick them, they were the successful ones. They were the ones who had survived, who done very well with the new models of that. But I'm hoping COVID has made it actually more likely for schools to engage in that, which I doubt. One thing I've been doing interviews recently for my book. And I want to ask a lot of these people. I said, well, they've seen a lot of innovations all these years. And I said, well, give me a percentage kind of guess. How many percent, what's the percentage of schools who are actually engaged in this kind of work? Most of them said, well, no more than 10%. So that's it's actually shocking, right? It's over the years, no more than 10%. What that means, 90% of the schools carry on what they used to do, and COVID was just an emergency they have to deal with. So Kurt, what do you think?
I think a couple of you got at the fact that schools need to think about moving away from learning for the future to learning in the present. And I think if Scott knows of a couple of places that do what he's just been describing, I think you should. Scott, have you been interviewing some of those folks? Would you like to bring them into a couple shows that we're going to have?
Yeah, I think Young and I both know lots of places that we could talk to, and I'm guessing that the rest of you do as well.
So there we go. I think it'd be really valuable. I think I'd be excited to have some of those folks in, and they'll build on some of people Young's brought in already. And I think you have a show coming up too, Young, don't you? You're working on?
Yeah, I'm working on the Global Online Academy. I've been in touch with them. The Global Online Academy is actually quite interesting. It started as a few private schools, like the Lakeside School, Punahou School, some of the quite well-known independent schools. And then they have schools from Jordan, from different countries. It's been there for a few years now. They just thought independent schools did not offer enough courses and teachers need to have online education. So they formed this consortium. They allowed teachers to take courses, to design online courses, and then more importantly, allow students to take courses from different institutions. So if you belong to one school, but you can take courses from other schools. And then this has become a successful nonprofit organization, then they're offering, courses now. It's kind of just fascinating to see how the idea of expanding learning opportunities, that struck me as something very innovative. And I think at COVID time, I thought it would be very, very cool to have many institutions to do that, have students engaged in global learning experiences. So, which is actually come down to the idea I want to ask Chris about is, I feel every day, we live in the best times and we live in the worst times. Remember that novel? And we live in the dark ages, we live in the bright ages. So it always feels really strange to me right now, because this is a time for invention. This is a time to escape from invention. This is actually, it's really, really fascinating to me. I have hope, and I have despair, I dread, but I'm hopeful. I was just wondering how all of us, including our audience, anybody, to just reflect this moment, to think about where is education in the future, which the specific question comes down to the issue about, do you think in the future, if students can truly learn online well, they can pay less to the local schools, or local schools should give really vouchers to students to do something more crazy? I'm only thinking about learning effectiveness, not about maintaining the public schools serve other purposes. So Chris, I was just wondering, what are you thinking about this big issues?
Well, I don't know that I'm going to be responsive to your questions, but there were two thoughts that occurred to me while you were talking. One of them was that we could make internet history by bringing in a Ouija board and interviewing Charles Dickens. And that would definitely be, a high visibility episode. But maybe we should be thinking a little bit more about marketing and increasing our audience. Instead of our next co-host session being our thoughts since the last one, maybe we should have a contest. So we'll develop a hypothetical $10 billion prize. And in our next host's episode, each of us will pitch what we think should get the hypothetical $10 billion. And then we could ask the audience, both the live audience and the archival audience over a 1-month period, to vote on whose idea they thought most deserved. Now, I'm just funning around, but I'm serious too, because we could do better marketing with the kind of ideas that we're having. And actually, a pitch that's multidimensional about the $10 billion prize is an interesting intellectual challenge.
I was on a show earlier this week with a Distance Ed webinar, with Distance Ed Journal webinar, christening a new issue. And one of the guests was John Begley, who is a retired distance educator, pretty well known in Canada. He's a former British actor, and they were saying he did great Charles Dickens acting when he was a graduate advisor. So we actually could get Charles Dickens in. I think John would be willing to serve that role if needed. But I like your notion of the prize, the grand prize. We could do that. That would engage people and get us, thinking about things they're saying more critically and so forth. So well, Scott, you were going to talk. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, Scott, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have any rush. So my pinned tweet on my Twitter account says the following: you want student learning to change, but you don't want to change teaching or schooling. Good luck with that. Right? And I think the reason that has been such a popular tweet is because it really gets at our theories of action, right? Like, we have a lot of school systems that have this grandiose rhetoric about changing student learning and student outcomes, but they've been very hesitant or resistant to actually change instruction or schooling structures, right? And so it gives us an opportunity to sort of ask some interesting questions about theories of action, right? Like, what's your theory of action? why do you think that if you don't change anything over here, that it's going to change over here, right? And I think the schools that sort of inspire me are the ones that have directly addressed that theory of action idea, right? And realize that if you want a new X to occur, that you have to also change the Y's and Z's that lead into it, right? And so, I'm baffled every day by these school systems or school leaders that have these, like I said, these sort of high-flying vision and mission statements about every student will be a 21st century learner able to contribute to the world around them and blah, 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 right? And they say, okay, but then over here, I see that very little has changed in terms of your day-to-day work that kids do. What's your theory of action there? Right? Like, how are you going to get from point A to point B, which is your desired outcome, when you don't change anything in point A? And so I think those are interesting conversations, right? And I think, this idea that a lot of the people that we've had on as guests are able to articulate different theories of action. We want different outcomes, and that means we have to do this differently, right? Which then accordingly solves this challenge. And so to the extent that we can retain that and keep that as we move forward, I think that would be good. But I think, really addressing some key issues and challenges through a lens of theory of action, how do we get from point A to point B, is probably worthwhile.
Scott, I think, and Kurt and Chris, I think so far, with or without Charles Dickens, we've run this for 32 episodes. And so from actually one angle, I'm very happy just to have a conversation with you guys on Saturdays. I'm pretty happy to say, okay. And any promotion we've done is through our own social media. That's what we have not really, we're not good marketers, we haven't tried that. Most of other webinars I participate, they get a lot of people, a lot of people, we have a lot of things. So one of the things, honestly, actually, we could do this 10 billion case, but we could really become, how about we can become a production, let's say, of ISTE, or maybe of American Association of Superintendents. How about we try to align with one big institution, and we can rely on them to promote that, because right now we are really haphazardly promoting through ourselves. I do think, with 32 episodes, we have enough evidence to say we do a good show. There's an interest in people. Some of them have received a lot of views. That's one thing. Second thing, when we started this show, we did not think about having invite 4 guests, then we do a reflection. It's kind of evolved into this model. And again, we did not have to do this model, we could do something different. But I was really curious about how about we align with 1 or 2 institutions? Anybody wants to think about that?
I like that idea. It feels like it needs to be a global institution, right? Because I'm thinking, for example, about AASA, which is the Superintendents Association for the United States, right? Like their interest in Global South educational issues is probably relatively minimal, and for their audience. So somebody who has a broader perspective than a national level one would probably be good.
Yeah, we could align with ASA, that we could find a global, like I know the Australian Center for Education Leadership, all those things. Yeah. Chris, you want to say something about UNESCO?
Well, I'm just thinking I don't know that they would be interested, but UNESCO, OECD, maybe the World Bank, and, Sheila's group. We have some friends in high places. We should maybe think about an alliance.
Yeah, I just think it will be meaningful because there are people who really are very good at organizing. Once they do it, they get thousands of people watching, and that's kind of interesting.
We've had Maxim Jean-Louis in from Contact North, and he's got a email list, I don't know, 120,000 long, that he sends out for all the shows that they do. So that's another possibility.
So can we maybe do some thoughts, sharing on email, some possible organization? They could all sponsor us. We should let them know. Basically, we are a no-cost organization that runs by
Seriously.
people's own energy. Punya, go
Yeah,
for it.
no, I think that's a really good idea because building up a market or an audience, there are people who are experts at that, or they already have mailing lists and lists, which and I think that this conversation, I think that they will, I think a conversation will also get better because of that, So I love that idea.
We could be their Mission Impossible team. VR in the Global South? No problem. We understand the secretary will disavow any knowledge of our activities.
Well, one thing I know for sure that including our audience, we are actually a very rare bunch of people because each one of us has our own collection of people we can reach, and we have our own ideas. We've done this. We're not just like simple hosts. We've done research. We still do research. We are not, just asking questions. We have ideas. So I think, let's pursue that. We might be able to get people to do it. We may have multiple organizations to sponsor it.
Yeah, we've had Rich
and the
Pallotta on from ISTE.
Cost to the organization isn't much, right? I mean, it really is that it is an email that goes out, and on the website we have the names of the sponsors. I think it should be okay.
Gerald Fussell raises an issue we've talked about before, which is to just take advantage of what we have and do some highlights videos that could be widely circulated on the internet. Take 3 episodes that we thought were interesting and put together a 15-minute kind of highlights film. And then we could have the private bloopers reel too, for the amusement of the co-hosts.
So to end this show, I really actually have a real question for all of you guys to think about. Not about really the future, but really a challenging question for you. What's your education transformation? What is it in your mind? Punya, we can start from you. How do you want to say education transformed?
So if I have to say like 2 changes that have occurred in me in the last few years. So one has moved me closer to Scott, which is I have become increasingly cognizant and sensitive to the role that systems and culture play, and that if there has to be impact, that it has to be at the level of systems and culture of organizations. That all the work, I love the work that I did when I was at Michigan State, which was, working with teachers and all of that, but that was inherently limited because it was not affecting the system within which they're working. The other move that has happened, I think, has moved me closer to Zhao in some ways, but that was always sort of incipient in me, which is that learning needs to be driven deeply by the passions and talents and of the individual learner. And so if anything that has become strengthened in this is that how do we develop systems which address the needs of the individual? Now that's where the tension is, right? Because the moment you think of systems, you automatically end up having these organizational structures and so on, which in some way become bureaucratic or whatever, for whatever reasons, start clumping people together. The moment you start clumping people together, you lose that key thing. And I think that's the knot that in my head, I've been really, really struggling with for the last, I would say, couple of years. But I think post-COVID or during this COVID thing and during these conversations, that has become like the most salient piece of the lot, right? Is that at one level, it's the individual, and another level that no change can happen unless it's at a system-wide systemic level. And there is this fundamental disjuncture there. And each one of us individually, with the students we work with the schools or districts we work with or whatever we do, we try to navigate that. But I think the question becomes, how do we do it in ways that are really powerful? And so, yeah, I think that to me is my question, and I don't think I will ever have the right final answer to it, or anybody will, but it seems like a worthwhile one for me to devote my time to.
Well, you're in the right position to do that. You're the associate dean. You have the right thing to do. Scott, what do you think? What's your education transformation? We keep talking about it.
I want schools to be less boring for kids. I'm tired of kids showing up every day and being bored out of their minds. And so how do we create learning environments that are inspiring and meaningful and relevant for kids? And I think we know how to do that. So then, as Punya says, how do we shift into the leadership behaviors, support structures, and other systemic changes that make that happen for as many kids as possible, with particular attention to underserved populations so that they get a chance for rich, robust learning as well.
Thank you. And Kurt?
That's a tough one. It's a real tough one. But what I'm seeing is that oftentimes in the news media or whatever I'm reading, they have a negative head byline. But then when you read deep, there's something really positive happening in there. The teachers they're interviewing are making a concerted effort for that change and for creative and active learning, as Scott's promoting. So they'll have this story that's going to headline on whatever show you watch, and they'll have you come back after the commercial break and you read for everyone to gripe and how awful it's going to be. And they interview some people and say, you know, we're working really hard. We're trying, you know. So what I'm seeing is people are really making a concerted effort in the midst of all the emotional baggage that they're facing, and that their students are facing, and that their parents are facing, and we all are facing huge emotional and psychological challenges in front of each of us every day. But despite that, the human spirit is embedded in these classrooms to so that they are trying new things. And when I'm doing different talks for folks around the world, they're sharing with me what they're trying out and what they found and what resources they've gathered as a department. Here in the Big Ten, we have something called Course Share. And as if you know me, my little side company consulting is called Course Share, but the Big Tens are doing some, sharing of courses, which you discussed earlier, giving people credit for what they're taking at someplace else. So the other thing that I think is transformative is that people are breaking rules. People are overcoming norms that they've had in the past, and all the procedures, all the have-tos, all you can't do's are going by the wayside for a wee bit of time. And if we can come back to some sense of normality and at the same time give up some of those you have to's and some of those procedures and some of those must do's, and let some flexibility in the system, and let teachers have some agency, as Chris might talk, and students have some agency in the system. Not let the system run us and dictate what we're going to do, but allow for the humanness that I see now, that and the creativity and the creative spirit, which Punya will promote all the time. And if you read Punya's writing, so that's what I see. I see a bit of the hope, the silver lining.
Well, I was hoping Chris say what do you think? You know, what do you think where education should go based on transformation? We've been having a hard time to categorizing all the innovations. People are doing different things. So where would it go, Chris?
Well, we already have working models for transformation, K to 12. Good Montessori schools, the Leap Innovations elementary schools in Chicago, Sean Losher's schools that were on our program, another course to college, which is a public high school in Boston that's lottery system. The problem is that we can't staff them. We can't staff them because heroic activities are required of the teachers to help students who've been marginalized throughout their lives, and because the level of dedication and the level of sophistication required is very high. So I think the model for transformation is to come up with a technological infrastructure that allows good teachers who are dedicated to enact at least most of those models, and then go home and have a personal life. And if we could have that kind of person-tool partnership, I think we could have our transformative model K-12.
Thank you, Chris. And well, basically, I'm going to end this. My view of a transformation is Punya has alluded to that, is really giving space for students to become owners of their own learning. That's really my big argument, that children needs to have that space. And Chris, you're running the next show, right? You're going to talk about next episode?
I've got next one.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go. Sorry, Kurt, go for it.
Real quick, we've got people from Nepal coming in to talk about high school and middle school kids learning English and other things via MOOCs and online education to prepare them for college and life. And they're getting certificates from the US Embassy in Nepal. So some very cool people, Bayman and Bishwa. They will be bringing some students in. So we'll have, this will be the first episode with adults and students. So we'll hear some stories of people who have taken, the high school kids taken multiple MOOCs and how that has transformed their life. And it started from one high school, Motherland Secondary School, and it's now been, the seeds have gone out to other high schools throughout Nepal. So even cooler. It's not just about one place, it's about how it can scale. So there we go.